The sun beat down on the manicured lawns of the Chicago suburb, a perfect, almost blinding Saturday. In this gated community, every house was a testament to success, with gleaming windows and perfectly pruned rose bushes. Sarah's home was no exception, a modern two-story structure where even the children's toys scattered on the lawn seemed artfully placed. Yet, a heavy silence hung in the air, a stark contrast to the cheerful chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, but rather held its breath, thick with unspoken words and carefully maintained secrets. The air inside, visible through the large picture window, seemed cooler, not from air conditioning, but from a tension that could chill a room more effectively than any machine. It was a place where happiness was a facade, meticulously constructed and deeply fragile. Ethan Hayes pulled his sensible sedan to the curb, the engine's soft rumble dying into the oppressive stillness. At 42, he wore the look of a man who built skyscrapers but couldn't fix the foundations of his own home. His clothes were practical, quality fabric that spoke of a comfortable salary, but the dark circles under his eyes told a story of long hours and a deeper, more personal exhaustion. He was here, unannounced. A quiet rebellion against the rigid weekend schedule that felt more like a business transaction than fatherhood. Finding the front door slightly ajar, he pushed it open gently, a familiar ache of guilt settling in his chest. He was the outsider here, the visitor in the life of his own child, and he moved with a caution born of the fear of breaking something he wasn't sure he could ever put back together. He found them in the living room, a sun-drenched space that felt strangely cold. Sarah was finishing dressing their 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, pulling a long-sleeved cotton dress over her small frame. It was an odd choice for a day so warm, a detail that snagged in Ethan's mind. As Sarah tugged at the cuff to straighten it, the fabric slid up just a fraction too far. For a single, horrifying second, a bruise was laid bare on Sophie's delicate forearm, a sickening bloom of purple and yellow against her pale skin. Sarah's frantic eyes shot up and met Ethan's across the room. In that instant, he saw it all. Raw panic, shame, and a desperate, failing attempt to conceal the truth. The air crackled, the unspoken reality of the mark on their daughter's arm screaming into the silence between them. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. His face, usually a canvas of weary responsibility, hardened into a mask of glacial fury. The warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by something cold and absolute. The silence stretched, more damning than any accusation he could have leveled. He then walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate, each one a silent vow. He ignored Sarah's stammering, her voice a weak flutter in the charged atmosphere. Reaching Sophie, he knelt, his large engineer's hand gently taking her small one. The contrast between his immense, contained rage and the tenderness of his touch was profound. He led his daughter toward the door, a silent, unyielding force, leaving her mother to crumble amidst her lies. A parent's world can shatter in one silent moment, and their next step defines everything. If you feel these journeys of quiet courage need to be told, subscribing helps us continue to share them. The short drive away from the house felt like an eternity. Ethan navigated the pristine, tree-lined streets on pure instinct, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Each perfect lawn and cheerfully painted mailbox was a mockery of the ugliness he had just witnessed. He pulled the car over just a few blocks away, under the shade of a large oak tree, and cut the engine. The sudden silence was a physical weight, pressing in on him, amplifying the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. In the back seat, Sophie was a statue, a tiny, silent figure lost in the cavernous space of the family sedan. He knew he had to speak, to do something, but the rage was a living thing inside him, a wild animal clawing at his ribs, demanding to be let out. He took a moment, forcing himself to count the cracks in the pavement outside his window, a grounding technique he used on high-stress construction sites. 1, 2, 3. He had to be the engineer now. The man who built things, not the man who broke them. He had to build a bridge to his daughter over this chasm of fear and pain. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and turned in his seat, the movement stiff and awkward. He saw her reflection in the rearview mirror, her large, expressive eyes filled with a terrifying combination of fear and confusion. She was watching him, waiting to see if he was another source of anger, another unpredictable adult in her fragile world. The sight of her quiet terror was enough to extinguish the last embers of his rage, replacing it with a deep, hollowing ache that felt far worse. Kneeling on the driver's seat to face her properly, he let his own carefully constructed facade crumble. The man who commanded teams of workers and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts was gone. In his place was just a father, broken and terrified. "Sophie, honey," he said, his voice a choked whisper that was barely audible. He couldn't bring himself to use clinical words like bruise or mark. They felt too sterile for the violation he had seen. Can you tell Daddy about your OE?" His gaze was fixed on her face, deliberately avoiding the long sleeve of her dress. He didn't want her to feel like a piece of evidence he was examining. He needed her to see the pain in his eyes, to know that her hurt was now his. Sophie's small shoulders, already so accustomed to hunching, drew up towards her ears. She looked down at her lap, her voice a tiny, rehearsed monotone as she recited the words that had been drilled into her. "I fell off my bike." The lie was so thin, so brittle, it shattered the moment it left her lips. Ethan didn't argue or pressure her. He simply let the silence hang between them, a silent testament to the untruth. He felt tears welling in his own eyes and didn't bother to hide them. He let her see his grief, his powerlessness. He wanted her to understand, in the simple, profound way that children do, that they were on the same side of this pain, and he wasn't going to let her carry it alone anymore. Seeing the tears tracking down her father's rugged face did what no amount of questioning could have. It gave her permission to feel her own sorrow. A small whimper escaped her lips, then another, and soon her small frame was racked with shuddering sobs. The carefully constructed wall of silence and obedience crumbled into dust. "It was Greg," she whispered through her tears, the name itself seeming to cause her pain. "He gets mad when I'm too loud. Mommy says not to tell anyone. She says he doesn't mean it." The confession, a secret she had carried like a physical burden, was finally released into the small, safe space of the car, and its weight was enough to crush the world Ethan thought he knew. Every word struck him like a physical blow, dismantling the man he had been just minutes earlier. The guilt was a tidal wave. While he was poring over blueprints and worrying about deadlines, his daughter was learning to be quiet, learning to hide her pain, learning to lie to protect the very people who should have been protecting her. The absent father, the man who used his career as a shield, died in that moment. In his place, something feral and absolute was born. It was the awakening of a paternal love so fierce and focused it eclipsed everything else. This was his foundation, his primary structure. Everything else was secondary. It's devastating to see how a child's world can be so broken, and if you believe these stories of protection deserve a voice, your subscription helps us bring them to light. His first, most visceral instinct was to drive back to that house, kick down the door, and unleash a kind of violence he hadn't felt capable of since he was a young man. The thought of Greg's smug, handsome face meeting his fists was a siren call, a promise of immediate, satisfying retribution. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, a red haze clouding his vision. But then he looked at Sophie, her terrified, tear-streaked face watching him, her small hands clutching the seatbelt. He saw in her eyes that she wasn't just afraid of Greg, she was afraid of his anger too. One impulsive, violent act, and he would become the monster. He would lose her to the very system he needed to save her. The engineer's mind fought back against the primal rage. Violence was messy, imprecise and temporary. What he needed was something permanent, something systematic. He needed to demolish Greg's life, not with his hands, but with his intellect. He had to be smarter, more patient, more ruthless. The fury was still there, a white-hot core inside him, but he began to encase it in a shell of cold, hard logic. This wasn't a street fight, it was a siege. He would not just defeat Greg, he would dismantle his reputation, his career, his entire life, using the truth as his only weapon. The plan began to form, not as a coherent strategy, but as a series of calculated steps. A blueprint for a quiet and total annihilation. His phone buzzed violently against the center console, displaying Sarah's name. He let it ring, the sound an unwelcome intrusion. It stopped, then immediately started again. He finally answered, putting the call on speaker so his hands wouldn't shake. "Ethan, what do you think you're doing? Bring her back right now!" Sarah's voice was high-pitched, laced with a desperate, defensive anger. "You're blowing this all out of proportion. It was a misunderstanding. Greg was just trying to discipline her. It was a time-out that went too far." Her words were a torrent of denial, a desperate attempt to repaint reality into something she could live with. He listened to her excuses, her complicity, and felt nothing but a cold, final certainty. He ended the call without saying a single word. He knew the battle ahead would be fought uphill. Greg was charming, successful, and well-liked. He was the kind of man who volunteered for the neighborhood watch and coached Little League. Ethan, on the other hand, was the divorced father who worked long hours, the relative stranger in this tight-knit community. He knew how it would look. He would be cast as the jealous ex-husband, the unstable outsider trying to stir up trouble. Greg's social armor was thick, polished by years of practiced charisma. To attack him directly, with only the word of a frightened 7-year-old, would be foolish. He had to find a way to make that armor shatter from within. He glanced in the rearview mirror again. Sophie's crying had subsided. She was just watching him now, her gaze intense and full of a child's profound wisdom. She was trying to read him, to understand if this new, powerful presence was real, if it was something she could finally trust. In that moment, he realized she wasn't just a victim he needed to rescue. She was his partner. Her courage in speaking the truth was the first step. His was to make sure it was the last step she ever had to take alone. He reached his hand back, and she hesitantly placed her tiny hand in his. He gave it a gentle squeeze, a silent contract passing between them. "I've got you now. I'm not letting go." He put the car in drive, pulling away from the curb, not with anger, but with a chilling sense of purpose. He wasn't driving home. Home was no longer a place, it was a mission. He would find a hotel, a safe space where they could breathe and he could think. He didn't have all the answers yet, but the objective was clear. He would protect his daughter, he would expose the truth, and he would ensure that Greg faced a justice far more complete than a simple arrest. The absent father was gone, replaced by a protector. The path to justice can feel so lonely, and your support in subscribing reminds us that we are not alone in wanting these voices to be heard. The Fairmont Ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers and expensive suits, a monument to corporate success. Greg was in his element, moving through the crowd with an easy smile, his hand resting possessively on the small of Sarah's back. She looked radiant in a silk dress, her laughter a little too bright, her eyes constantly scanning the entrance. The announcement of Greg's promotion to vice president was the evening's main event, the culmination of his carefully constructed life. Then, a figure appeared in the grand archway, a man whose simple, dark suit seemed to absorb the light around him. It was Ethan. He carried no invitation, only a chilling stillness that cut through the festive hum. He wasn't there to celebrate. He was there to tear down the temple, and every person who saw the look in his eyes felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. He moved with the unhurried deliberation of a demolitions expert inspecting a foundation, his gaze sweeping over the room before locking onto the stage. As the company's CEO began a glowing introduction for Greg, Ethan calmly intercepted a technician near the soundboard. A few quiet, firm words, and a look that promised consequences no one wanted to explore were all it took. He walked onto the stage just as the CEO finished, taking the microphone from the stunned man's hand. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Greg's smile faltered, turning into a tight, questioning line. "I apologize for the interruption." Ethan's voice was steady, amplified throughout the cavernous hall. "But I'd also like to offer a toast, a special tribute to the kind of man Greg truly is when he believes no one is watching." Instead of raising a glass, Ethan held up a small digital audio recorder and pressed play. The room fell silent, expecting a pre-recorded accolade. What filled the air instead was the sound of a child's breath, small and shaky. Then a voice, unmistakably Sophie's, trembled from the speakers. "He gets mad when I'm too loud. He grabs my arm really hard." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. The recording continued, her tiny voice painting a devastating picture of fear and pain in her own home. "Mommy says not to tell anyone. She says he doesn't mean it, but it hurts." The clarity of the audio was brutal, each innocent word an indictment that echoed off the crystal glasses and stunned faces. The festive celebration had instantly transformed into a courtroom, and everyone present was the jury. The charismatic mask on Greg's face didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed horror. He looked from the speakers to Ethan, his eyes wide with the animal panic of being caught in a trap he never saw coming. Across the room, Sarah let out a choked, guttural sob that was swallowed by the horrifying silence. Her perfectly constructed world had been leveled by the sound of her own daughter's truth. She crumpled to the floor, her silk dress pooling around her as she wept. Finally and publicly confronted with the consequences of her complicity, Ethan stood perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of cold resolve. He didn't need to shout or accuse. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had destroyed them. With the last of Sophie's whispered words fading into the ringing silence, Ethan placed the recorder gently on the lectern as if it were a sacred offering. He turned his back on the wreckage of 2 lives and walked off the stage. The crowd parted for him, a sea of shocked, horrified faces. No one spoke, no one moved to stop him. He walked through the grand ballroom, his footsteps the only sound in a world he had just broken open. He wasn't fleeing the scene of a crime. He was leaving a demolition site where the work was finally complete. His stride was not one of vengeance, but of liberation. He was walking away from the past and toward his daughter, who was waiting safely for the father who had finally and completely come home for her. The legal fallout was swift and decisive. With the public scandal and the irrefutable audio evidence, Greg was arrested before the night was over. Ethan secured emergency custody of Sophie without a fight, and in the following months it became permanent. They moved out of the sterile, sprawling house he had bought after the divorce, and into a smaller, cozier apartment in a different part of the city. A place with warm wooden floors and big windows that let in the morning light. He sold his shares in the engineering firm he had helped build, taking a less demanding consulting role that allowed him to be home every single night for dinner. The skyscrapers he once built seemed like monuments to a different man. A man who hadn't understood that the most important structure he would ever be responsible for was the small, fragile world of his own daughter. The healing was not a single event, but a slow, patient process built from 1,000 quiet moments. It was Ethan clumsily learning to braid Sophie's hair, his large calloused fingers fumbling with the fine strands until he got it right. It was the two of them attending therapy sessions together, where Sophie learned to give voice to her fears and Ethan learned to truly listen, not as an engineer solving a problem, but as a father absorbing his child's pain. He read to her every night, not just stories of princesses and dragons, but of brave girls who found their strength. He taught her how to build elaborate structures with Lego bricks, and in doing so, he was teaching her that things that are broken can be rebuilt, stronger and more beautiful than before. He was no longer the visitor, he was the constant, the anchor in her unsteady world. 5 years later, the echo of that trauma had faded to a whisper. Sophie, now a vibrant and confident 12-year-old, stood on a brightly lit stage in her middle school auditorium. She wasn't the quiet, hunched girl anymore. She was the lead in the school play, her voice clear and strong as it filled the room. In the third row, Ethan watched, his face a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. He saw no trace of the fear that had once clouded her expressive eyes. He saw only joy, confidence, and the unshakable security of a child who knows, without a single doubt, that she is loved and safe. He wasn't just watching his daughter perform, he was witnessing the living, breathing proof of a promise kept. The beautiful, thriving future he had fought so quietly and fiercely to secure for her. Ethan's own life had found a new blueprint. He had channeled the cold fury of that day into a quiet, unwavering purpose. 2 nights a week, he volunteered at a local child advocacy center, using his own harrowing experience to guide other parents through the confusing and terrifying legal system. He wasn't a therapist or a lawyer, but he spoke a language they understood, the language of a parent's fear and unconditional love. He shared his story not for praise, but to show others that they were not alone. He knew that true strength wasn't in demolishing a man's life in a ballroom, but in rebuilding a child's life in the quiet safety of home. Sharing these journeys of survival and love is so important. And by subscribing, you help create a space where more of these stories can give others the courage to fight.